Well, hello everyone. Hope you're having a fabulous day. You are joining us right now in our live stream called Let Us Reason. I'm your host, Fadi, and with me here is our dear brother, Dr. J. Smith, who is doing fine. You can see him, praise the Lord, because we had to postpone our live stream. I must admit to all of you, I myself was worried about him when he told me about the symptoms that he had, but praise the Lord. And shortly I'm going to ask him, of course, to give you any update he feels comfortable sharing with you. But all that to say is that if you've been following us on our YouTube channel, Sira International, recently, myself and Dr. J. Smith, we talked about this book by Dr. Daniel Allen Brubaker, Dr. Brubaker, basically, and he extrapolated about 20 examples, a little over 20 examples from his research, his thesis on the corrections that he found in early Quranic manuscripts. So we did a series on that, and I think it was 9 videos, and we called it just that, corrections in early Quranic manuscript. And it was really an enjoyable series. We received a lot of basically views and many interactions and many comments from both Muslims and also Christians and also others as well. And by the way, we even have comments from people who are Hindus who were fascinated by that kind of stuff that we did. So today we are going to respond to an academic critique that was issued by someone. His name is Hythem Sidky. Graduated from the University of Chicago, has a PhD basically in molecular biology, but he's a layperson who is fascinated by early Quranic manuscripts and did a book review of Dr. Brubaker, and it's called Response to Brubaker's Corrections in Early Quranic Manuscripts, 20 Examples, and it was published in a journal called Al-Usur Al-Wusta. I think it's edition 27 in 2019, pages 273 to 288. With that says, I want to basically turn it over to my dear brother, Dr. J. Dr. J, welcome, brother. Thank you so much for making time for us, and we praise the Lord that you are healthy. Please let people know that they can calm down now.
Yes, there's no reason. It was just a quick flu. Now, here is the response. This is what we're talking about. Al-Fadi has just introduced it. Here is Hythem Sidky's response. It's about 16 pages long, goes from 273 to 288. It's in a compilation of many articles. That's why it has those page numbers. And in it, he goes and he confronts Dr. Brubaker, not just on this book, but much of the way he used and looked at the book. Now, what I did and what I want to do and what we want to do today, this will be just the one of many broadcasts because there's too much material here. I went ahead and did a response myself to Hythem Sidky, which is 10 pages long in and of itself. Now, we're not going to get through all that today. There's just not enough time. Because I thought that what Sidky did, and he did a favor, actually, he did Brubaker a favor, and this is what we call peer review. Interestingly, when you're in academic circles, peer review sometimes takes months. This has been out since May of 2019. This took a few months before it was written, so we're talking about months to get peer reviewed. The nice thing about Facebook and the nice thing about YouTube, we get peer reviewed immediately. And you will see the comments even on this broadcast. People are going to keep coming back and they're going to be responding to what we say, which is great. And that's why, for heaven's sakes, those of you who are watching, if there are Muslims who are watching, please write your comments, put them in there so we can see how you respond to what we're saying. We're not going to we're not going to go through all 10 pages of my response. This is just too long. We're going to have to split this up. There are 13 different criticisms I have of Sidky in my response. And what I want to do is I want to discuss these criticisms with Al-Fadi. Al-Fadi is doing his doctorate in this area. Al-Fadi, you're doing your doctorate on the Sana manuscript, are you not?
That's correct.
And so many
That's correct.
arguments you're bringing into your doctorate, aren't you?
I am, and especially because the Sana manuscript is perceived to be earlier than even the so-called Uthmanic tradition. At least that's the general consensus.
Is that your consensus as well?
So far, I'm finding evidence that will justify me at least focusing on it as if it's an earlier product before this tradition took place, or something that slipped by when the tradition happened. So we're still analyzing different ways of looking at it.
You can see he's hedging his bets. He's being very careful what he's saying, because he has to be careful. He can't say anything until he publishes. But we're going to keep trying to eke it out of you little by little throughout the next few months. Now, looking and knowing and understanding, this is your area of expertise. This is really, you're the expert in this area. I'm not. This is not my area of expertise. And that's why it's great that we're bringing you on board for this. We've just been in contact with Dr. Brubaker. We've talked to him about this response. He may write a review on it himself. He may do a response. But it's fascinating when you look at, and just to do an overview, Sidky has done a good job of trying to, in his best way, trying to bring his viewpoint, and it really is his viewpoint of how the Quran was written, and using that viewpoint, he starts with a presupposition that's completely different than that of Dan Brubaker, and also than you and I. And you will see this in the comments that are there, and we're going to help as we go through each one of these criticisms, these 13 areas. We're going to show you how much of it starts from the premise of where you begin. Where is your presupposition? And I think, isn't this a problem, Al-Fadi, we have with an awful lot of other Muslims and also of other scholars concerning anything, whether it has to do with the Bible or the Quran. Where you start with will reflect on not only where you go, where you land out, but also your critiques of others who don't start from the same supposition or presupposition in this case.
Well, I mean, you really have to, I mean, that's my view. You have to look at the argument that we have at hand. And, you know, my presupposition might vary from yours, for instance. My presupposition says that there is no such thing as Uthmanic, for instance, tradition. And therefore, anything I'm going to try to reach or conclude in my research will need to line up with this presupposition that I have. I have to, you know, present my evidence to support my presupposition.
Okay. And it's interesting that we're going to get into that later. Let's don't jump into that right now. Let's get start with the first question that I have. And the first question is, why is it that Sidky brings us up and he applauds Brubaker for the fact that he is the first to actually write in this area.
That is
He's
true.
the first to actually publish in this area. He's the first to actually get out there and mention that there are variants, that these are not just, this is nothing to do with diacritical variants. This is nothing to do with vowelization variants. These are what they call razm variants. And he's the first. Now, why is it, Al-Fadi, you're from a Muslim background, you have from Saudi Arabia, you've grown up with the Arabic language, you've grown up with the Quran as, even since you were yay high to a grasshopper as being God, holy word. Why is it that this kind of study has not been done within the Muslim world?
Well, because it's taboo. I mean, if you are telling a Muslim anywhere, in the school, in the mosque, the Muslim in the streets, that, by the way, the Quran that you have in your hand today went through a process of editing. Let's just call it editing. You know, we don't want to say corruption or anything beyond that, which, by the way, it's automatically will lead into that conclusion. But let's say it is just the idea that what you have today really wasn't exactly the one that was revealed word for word at the time of the Prophet of Islam, as the Muslim is programmed to believe. This is damaging to their faith, damaging to their own presuppositions, and also that will shut up the argument that a Muslim will have against the Bible, because now they have a bigger problem to worry about than worry about our Bible.
Okay, let me ask another question on this. Having grown up in Saudi Arabia, having gone to school there, you did your first degree there. Is there no school in Saudi Arabia that has a historical critical analysis of the Quran? Does that not exist in Saudi Arabia?
Absolutely not that I'm aware of. And even if it is existing, it's only part of studying, let's say, the body of the commentaries. Like, for instance, someone like a Zamakhshari or a Suyuti and others like them, they would make reference to, oh, so-and-so used to read this way, or so-and-so used to read it that way, but you don't think much about it. You feel like, oh, okay, so one of the readings, and that's it, and you move on.
And we will be talking about the readings, because that's not what Dan Brubaker is. His whole book has nothing to do with the readings. That's for another question, another time. But
that is correct.
On this, you're suggesting me this whole thing with redacted criticism, source criticism, so what we know as historical criticism, literary criticisms, all these criticisms that are part of what we know as biblical criticism, created on the Bible, obviously. these don't exist in any school there in Saudi Arabia or in the Middle East or in the Arab-speaking world?
Brother, I will be extremely surprised if there is any school that teaches such a thing, and they're even sanctioned by the authority to teach it.
Well, is there any biblical criticism that you could? Does this exist? Does biblical criticism, like looking at sources of the Bible, looking at the problems with the earliest manuscripts of the Bible, does that even exist?
Well, I'm going to use Saudi as an example. In Saudi, you're told the Bible is corrupt. Why? End of discussion. That's what the authority are saying. The Bible is corrupt. Don't look at it. Don't care for why or how or who. In other words, you don't even have a copy of the Bible to go and examine it for yourself. Now, in some other areas in the Middle East, they may allow you to do textual criticism of the Bible, but you're not allowed to do such thing when it comes to the Quran.
Again, okay, so the Bible is corrupt. Are they not supporting that? Are they not arguing it? Are there not give and take? Are there not two positions? Do they not have debates on this? Certainly that must exist.
Not at all. Not in the Middle East. They will exist, ironically, in areas like in Europe, in Canada, in South America, in Southeast Asia. You begin to see debates like this. You probably have debated some people. I mean, I'm pretty sure, I think you debated even Shabir Ali on issues like this. That's allowed to do these kind of debates as long as you're not messing with the Quran yourself. You as a Muslim, your view is that to expose the Bible as a corrupt book. Now, to go to a school, let's say the university in Mecca where I went, or later on in the engineering university that I went to say that I want to take a class about textual criticism in general, about manuscripts, and I want to look at the Bible manuscript, I want to look at the Quranic manuscript, I want to look at somebody else's manuscript. No such science exists at all.
Okay, so help me here. I'm still questioning, because to me this is kind of I don't understand a world where these kind of questions are not asked. I'm not even asking about the Quran. I'm just asking about the Bible. Even the Bible, they don't have this kind of criticism. They don't have redacted criticism. They don't have references to
not in Saudi,
Mari or the Ebla tablets, all these tablets that are now coming to the fore. None of this. There's no school anywhere in the Middle East or in the Muslim world that talks about these.
You know, brother, there may be a school in the Middle East today, but in my days, it was a taboo. And I can speak for Saudi. None of this ever existed in any of the universities that are approved by the government to teach on such topic. You're told from a very young age, by the way, the Bible is corrupt. They'll use the Quran to try to justify the corruption of the Bible. You'll come across stories, in the Sirah, why the Bible, basically was rejected, or at least the Prophet of Islam did not really, let's say, endorse it as the authority, even though he respected it, by the way. The Prophet of Islam respected it. The Hadith never said anything negative about it. But you are being told that the Quran is your final authority.
Okay, let's take that one last thing you're talking on board. Let's just say somebody is reading the Quran and they come across verses like chapter 2, verse 79, or chapter 10, verse 94, or chapter 21, verse 7, or chapter 5, verse 46, which are all references to how great the Bible is and how supportive the Bible is. And if you have any questions, go back to the Bible. Go back to the Tawrat and the Injil, chapter 10, 94, chapter 21, 7. So a student in Saudi Arabia reads this. Does he not come forward and ask, well, what do we do about these verses that support the Bible? Is that discussion not happening in Saudi Arabia?
It does happen these days, I can assure you, because of the use of YouTube, the use of the social media, even satellite programming. Somebody like Father Zachariah Butros, who began to bring to the forefront issues like this and showing evidence that the Bible is not corrupt as Muslims thought it. Only then some of these youngsters began to ask this right question, and even sometimes even mid-age people, but they get criticized immediately, or sometimes their life could be in danger by the authority. So they even have to be careful. But sometimes there are excuses for these things. They will tell you, oh, that would have been abrogated. Maybe it was there. Or it's not talking really about Muhammad going to ask. It's out talking about you. But why would you want to go? Because the Quran is the final authority. I mean, there is always ways to get around these kind of things.
Understood. There's ways to get around it. But here's what's fascinating to me. When these questions were first brought up about the Bible in the 1800s in Germany, people like Wellhausen and others who were at the University of Tübingen, especially in Germany, when these were started to be asked, which are perfectly legitimate questions, the documentary hypothesis, for instance, the whole thing with source criticism of the Old Testament. Do we know that the first 11 books of Genesis ever existed? Was there someone named Abraham? These were being asked on the university campuses. They
Exactly.
then filtered down into the seminaries. That then filtered down into the churches, which then filtered down into the pews, which decimated the church by 1905 in Europe, and parts of the church have never recovered in Europe. Now, what's fascinating, as that came down to the pew level and it came down to the seminaries, the Christians, scholars, got to work on it and say, well, these are good questions. We've got to answer them. So they had to go and they had to find reference after reference. They had to go and look and see, where can we find references to Abraham? Where can we find these customs? And that's why these tablets, like the Nuzi and the Mari and the Ebla tablets, they've just been found in the last century and a half. They have supported and substantiated the credibility of the Genesis account for someone like Abraham. These kind of things that happened, it happened because it started on the academic level, which then moved its way down into the popular level. And the popular level, the pastors and priests had to have answers for those who in the pews were saying, what we're hearing that the Bible is corrupt. We're hearing the Bible is nothing more than oral tradition. We're hearing it's nothing more than folk tales and that have been amalgamated and put together in the 6th century BC and redacted back to the 19th and the 18th century BC. Is this true? And the priests and the pastors had to find responses to that. Certainly this must be happening in Saudi Arabia. Certainly this must be happening in the Middle East. Certainly this must be happening certainly in the Muslim world, where questions are coming from the internet. You say it's all over the internet. It's on the popular level now. Why aren't they then bringing this back to the universities in Saudi Arabia and into the seminaries in Saudi Arabia and we're using Saudi Arabia because that's where you're from. Why is this not why are there not responses coming from these kind of questions? These are much more technical questions. These are much more devastating kind of questions. These kind of questions that we have here. Why isn't this being questioned on the streets? Why isn't this being answered? This material that Brubaker has got, why is this not being responded to by the academics, by the powers that be within the universities and the seminaries there in Saudi Arabia?
Because if you allow this discussion in the Middle East or in universities like in Saudi Arabia, for instance, or the other Gulf states, or even Al-Azhar and other places, what you're doing is basically you're telling your Muslim student now it's okay for you to think critically of the word of Allah and decide for yourself if this is a preserved word, as the Quran says, or if this is fabricated, or part of it were corrected or maybe added. And therefore, there goes your faith in Islam, technically. Okay,
so you're just saying this, really the Middle East, the Arab world is just not ready for these kind of questions yet.
I don't think so. And the proof of that is, like, where do you see, there's a lot of, by the way, wonderful, fine Muslim scholars who are doing work on the Quranic manuscripts who will agree with me and you on these kind of discoveries that we're talking about, who will agree with Dr. Brubaker. But where are they doing their studies? In Europe. They dare not to do it in there because their life will be questioned.
Okay, so it's not healthy to ask these kind of questions.
That's right.
And is it only this area of study that you cannot ask?
I mean, the Quran comes at the top, of course, but even when you venture into questioning whether Muhammad existed or not, that's a big, issue. Or about the character of Muhammad, for instance, if you want to do just a simple study and say, I'm going to compare the Prophet of Islam to Jesus, for instance, at the university in Al-Azhar, and I'm going to expose both the good and the bad. That's a no-no right there. You cannot, the Qibla, by the way, the Qibla stuff that we've been dealing with, you and I, the stuff that Dan Gibson has been doing, that's a no-no, because you're destroying the foundation of this religion by poking holes in any of its, let's say, the cornerstones. The Quran is a cornerstone. The Sirah is a cornerstone. The Hadith is a cornerstone. The teachings about prayer and direction of prayer and things like that are cornerstone. And once you start, poking holes in it, all you're doing is you're making it look like it's nothing. Don't worry about it. You choose whatever you want to follow.
Well, isn't this your testimony yourself? You got fed up with the answers you were getting. You were not satisfied with what you were hearing. You realized that the Quran was not what you thought it was, that the Bible and the person of Jesus Christ in the Bible is what attracted you. And in some ways, this is your own testimony. This is your own witness.
That is true. And many others that you talked to recently, especially young, Muslims these days, they are becoming more and more aware of these arguments. But there's still something about Islam, by the way. They're either concerned for their safety or the safety of their family, or they're just in denial because, remember, you're brainwashed to believe something all of your life. I don't care how young you are. And all of a sudden, somebody is creating tension for you to start thinking negatively about this and look for an alternative. That's not an easy thing, psychologically speaking.
Okay, so that explains then why Dan Brubaker is unique. What he has done is so unique. This should have been around for 1,000 years ago. This kind of criticism, critique, looking at the manuscript should have been done when the manuscripts were first unveiled. They should have been doing this from the very beginning. It's fascinating to me that an American, he's an American who did his doctoral research, was the first one to go to any one of these went to every one of these different museums, and he went to these different libraries, and he just took pictures. And then as he was looking at and unpacking and seeing what was in front of him, he thought he was looking maybe possibly for 10 or 15 scribal mistakes. He's found over 4,000 now in these original manuscripts. And these are not original, forgive me, that's not the right word, these earliest manuscripts, which then helps me understand why what he has done has caused such a shock, and what he has done has caused such an anger. It also helps me understand when I read the comments. And listen, we do read the comments, don't we, Al-Fadi? We look at the comments when
Absolutely.
And when you read the comments, you can see many of the comments from the Muslims are just ignorant. They're just hopeless comments. They're full of vitriol, and they have nothing to do with the video, with what we're talking about. We're going to get it with this one as well. They're all going to be trying to change the subject, trying to get off the subject back onto the Trinity, or whether or not we believe God come to earth, which has nothing to do with what we're talking about. And I've always wondered, why is it that Muslims can't keep the subject? And it could be that they're not capable. As you're saying, it seems to me they are not capable of really wrestling with these kind of questions, such as, are there many different Qurans? When was the first Quran? Why is it that the earliest manuscripts don't agree? And where is it they don't agree? Are there theological differences? Who wrote this first Quran? And we'll be unpacking these as we go on through these different shows on the Quran and on Dan Brubaker. But I'd like to go to the next one. That's been very good. Thanks, Al-Fadi, because in some ways you can speak to this better than anybody else, having been brought up in Saudi Arabia, having gone through the educational system there, understanding it better probably than anybody else, having moved to the West, and also having accepted Christianity, many reasons, because of what you found in Christianity that you could not find in Islam. But now that you've also lived, I don't know how many years you've now lived in the United States, you see both sides. You are able to go and step back and forth between both systems and both areas of education. This area of education is nothing very controversial in United States or in the West or in Europe and other places. It is highly controversial, as you're telling me, certainly within Saudi Arabia. The second question I want to bring up is something else that Sidky said. And I'm just going to read his quote. So I'll just read his quote. He said here, in contrast to the scripture of the early Christian community, he, referring to Dan Brubaker, correctly states the Muslim scripture enjoyed an elevated status under a dominant political hegemony from an early period, and thus was not subject to censorship or destruction. Okay, so that's fascinating. So unpack that for me. So what he's saying here, see if this is correct. The Quran was created in an atmosphere of power, of political power, whereas the Bible was not. The Bible was written under persecution. The early church was hated by the surrounding community. It did not have any political power. It did not have any. They were living in the catacombs. They were being persecuted right, left, and center. We do know of even the Edict of Diocletian in 300 AD, where as many Bibles as they could find, they burned, they destroyed. That's why we don't have many of the earliest ones. And it wasn't really until Constantine became emperor and who was converted to Christianity that he made it the official religion. And that was in the 4th century that we really find political power supporting the Bible. This for the first 300 years, this did not exist in Christianity and not exist for the Bible. On the other side, on the Quranic side, it was very much manufactured by the caliphs. It was Caliph Uthman in fact, according to the tradition, it was the Caliph Abu Bakr who was the first one to not create it, but to write down the first Quran, the first recension. And there was Caliph Uthman, who is the king, had all the political power, who then created, who had compiled the second recension, both of them using Zayd ibn Thabit. So both of them were compiled by caliphs, and it was the caliph himself who then sent it out to every province. And we're going to talk more about that in another broadcast as to how many provinces we're talking about. But nonetheless, it was from the top. It was coming from political control. Help me unpack this. Why is that important when you do a comparison between the two?
That's extremely important because what we have is this. And I don't know, I'm hearing myself echoing, by the way, for some reason. We call it the Uthmanic Quran, right? The Uthmanic collection. We call it the Uthmanic Rasm. We call it the 1924 Cairo edition. What does that tell you? It's not called the Muhammad's Quran, by the way, or Allah's Quran. It is actually called the Uthmanic Quran. And that speaks in and of itself to the political environment that this thing existed in. In other words, someone by the name Uthman decided single-handedly to decide which readings should stay and which readings should not. In fact, when you read the traditions, he even instructed the scribes to use the Qurayshi reading or dialect over anything else whenever there is disagreement. That's telling in and of itself.
Explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, well,
what do you mean by Qurayshi?
Supposedly, he instructed the committee members. Now, there is differences in how many members were. Some tradition will say there was 5 of them. Another one says there were 12 of them. 12 is interesting, by the way. But, the common, consensus is that there was 4 of them. Zayd ibn Thabit was one of them. And he said, listen, whenever you disagree among yourselves about how to write something, use the Qurayshi dialect of how it sounds and write it that way, because it was revealed in Qurayshi dialect. The Qurayshi dialect is a dialect of the prophets of Islam's own tribe. If it was revealed in the Qurayshi dialect, Jay, why is it then that we hear that it was revealed in 7 different readings? I mean, it's kind of puzzling to me.
Can we come back to that? That's a great question.
Absolutely.
But let's talk about the political environment. Explain to me why the political environment with the Quran stands completely different than the biblical environment.
Because if you dare to stand up against the caliph back then, you are probably going to be thrown in jail or lose your life. Those who dare to stand against him suffered, at least at the beginning. We know Abdullah bin Mas'ud was one of them, even though he was one of the companions of the Prophet. Other writings were taken, or Quranic copies were burned. When you take copies, competing copies in this case, and you burn them, aren't you technically speaking deciding on what should survive and what should not? That in of itself is a controlled environment now, versus the Bible is so healthy because we can trace back to the original because we have so many copies, abundant of them, and no one can tell you, oh, this is the only way it could have been read, because we can refute that argument and say, no, earlier manuscripts disagree with you when it comes to this reading.
Okay, now, like with like, let's do this like, because you've already brought a good like with like here. There is an overarching control with both scriptures. In the case of the Quran, let me get my Bible back here. In the case of the Quran, you have a caliph who is a king who is deciding which is that final recension. He is the one that creates the canon. In the case of the Bible, you have a church authority. So you do have an apostolic authority that decided which books were to remain and which were not. But there was I don't know of any synod where that was created. The canon itself, and there's a whole study on the canon. We can't go into that today. But the whole study of the canon came about almost by happenstance as to who was the writers. There are 5 criteria, but those 5 criteria were not created by a king or by a caliph or by an emperor. That was done long before Constantine came into power. So the canon over here was not created in a political control. There was no real political control. It was decided by apostolic authority. In this case, there is a political control. So it really came down to one man who decided what the Quran was going to be.
Exactly. I mean, you're not reading that Uthman. I mean, here's what's so interesting, Dr. J. Doesn't the tradition teach that earlier, right after the death of the Prophet, supposedly the closest friend of Muhammad, Abu Bakr, the father of Aisha, his 9-year-old bride, who became the first caliph, and Umar is one of his best companions. Umar was like his bodyguard, technically speaking, the second caliph. They also ended up collecting the Quran out of fear of losing it because of the War of the Apostates, but then they gave that copy to Hafsa, right? I mean, that's what happened. So why is it that Uthman felt the need to start all over again 20 years later?
We're going to get into
He could have
that.
used the same thing that Hafsa did.
Well, I mean, we could jump into that now if you want to, since we're talking about the historical precedents for both books. Let's talk about that. It's a good, maybe this is a good segue into it. This is something that Sidky does not refer to, and this is one thing I think I would love Sidky to have referred to, because Sidky is melded to this principle that the Uthmanic recension did exist.
That's right. That's what
there were four
the presupposition he's using. Exactly.
That's a presupposition. So he comes from that presupposition. Dan does not. Dan Brubaker does not start from that presupposition.
As he should, by the way. As he should. As you should. As I should.
What do you mean? As we should do or should not? What do you mean by should?
No, we should not use the Uthmanic tradition as a presupposition, because there is so much evidence these days that you cannot overlook and discount and say, oh, that's maybe really a shawazd reading or heretical readings. Or I mean, it's kind of funny, by the way. The minute you bring up something that you say this could be earlier than Uthman, all of a sudden dating become a problem now. You know, how can you prove it? Well, even anything after Uthmanic tradition also have a dating problem.
Okay, let me just pull you out on that, because you're saying that we should not take the Uthmanic recension as authoritative. And what's the first reason that comes to mind? Why should we not take the Uthmanic recension as gospel truth or Quranic truth?
Well, from my perspective, I just mentioned, you know, you have an earlier collection already by Uthman, by Abu Bakr and Umar, and supposedly Hafsa had a copy. So why did we have to start all over again? Number two, I don't find any evidence that Uthman was given any authority, granted authority by the Prophet of Islam. In fact, he even didn't come to Islam until later on compared to the others, technically. He wasn't involved in any of these traditions early on until he became a caliph, and he was troubled by the fact that there were different readings. And the list can go on and on and on. And then you have traditions that contradict each other. Some says that he made 4 copies. Some said he made 5 copies. Some said he made 7 copies. Some said he sent them to all the regions, which could be 9 copies. I mean, so which one should you believe?
Okay, so you looking from a political standpoint, this doesn't make sense. That's good. Now, I would come to it from a completely different standpoint. I would do it from a historical standpoint. Where does this whole story come from to begin with?
Well, I mean, dare I say Abu Bukhari, for instance? And
Volume 6, Hadith number 509 and 510. So everything that if you're going to start from that position, you're going to have to assume from the get-go that Al-Bukhari is correct, that Al-Bukhari got it correctly.
And that's another
when did
man.
Al-Bukhari live? He didn't write this down till 870.
That's
right. 240 years after the fact. So if you're going to start from this position, if you're going to be a scientist, if you're going to be a historian, which Sidky should be doing, and which Sidky should be saying, because I don't know of any good historian that starts from the premise that we must take that which is written 240 years after the fact, take that as gospel truth, and let's try to fit everything into that paradigm or that narrative, which is what I see Sidky doing all the way through this paper, all the way through here. He does the same problem. Go ahead.
May I bring something interesting here? How often, Dr. J, you've heard Muslims say, oh, the Bible you have today and the number of gospel was determined at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD.
Yes, we get that all the time. I love the one where they say that Constantine put 200 books on a table, and they shook the table, and they waited to see which was the one that stayed on the last. The last one to remain is the Bible that we have today. That's all over the Muslim world. I get it all the time, and I try to wonder where it comes from, and it comes from actually Ahmad Didat, who said that in a debate. But Ahmad Didat was getting it from a 16th century Muslim scholar who made it up on the top of his head. It's just like, it sounds like a good story. It's a fairy tale. But it's fascinating how Muslims suggest that that's how we got our Bible. And the question needs to go right back. How did the Muslims really get their Quran? How did these 114 books, how did they get compiled into one place? Sidky starts from the premise that this was done by Uthman.
That's right. And once you do that, then you can shoot down anything else because it makes it easier for you now to refine it and just focus on the traditional way of analyzing things. Okay,
and we're going to use this, and this is a good place. We don't have much time. We only have about another half hour to go, but we can start from this premise. If you start from that presupposition, if you start from that, presupposition is a good word to use, then if that's the only, then everything else you're going to see, everything else you're going to look at has to fit into that narrative, you can see then why Dan and Sidky, Hythem, are talking past each other. They're talking right past each other.
Exactly.
You and I do not start from that. In fact, we have always, we have been on record many times, haven't we, Al-Fadi, for saying that we do not trust those later traditions. We do not trust Al-Bukhari. They come too late. If we were to trust Al-Bukhari, then we would have to do the same thing to our own Bible. And we'd have to say that we could know nothing about Jesus Christ. We would not know who Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were till the 3rd century. Nothing would be known about him until the 3rd century, about what Jesus said or what Jesus did.
Precisely.
How could we defend Jesus? And yet I don't hear anybody. I mean, I'm surprised. I can understand why Muslims have to take that default, because that's all they've got. That's all they've got. They've only got Ibn Hisham for the Siddha. You can say you can say Ibn Ishaq from 765, but we don't even have Ibn Ishaq. We're dependent on Ibn Hisham. So that's why I like to take Ibn Hisham, because he's 833. You'd have to go to Al-Bukhari, 870. You have to go to Sahih Muslim, 875. You have to go to Al-Tabari, 923. So 9th and 10th century for everything that happened in the 7th century. If you're going to start from that presupposition, I can understand why Muslims have to, because that's all they've got. But why is Sidky starting from that presupposition? Why in the world is he doing something that he would never do with the Bible and he would never do with any other piece of literature? Help me here. I can't understand where Sidky's coming from.
I mean, I have to just make assumptions here. I don't know him very well. He's probably just, relying on some academic research, maybe. There is these kind of researches out there, by the way, that will tell you we can prove really that the earlier Quranic manuscripts could be traced back to a basically exemplar. What do I mean by that? Meaning that there was an original copy that they were copying from. And they use 4, interestingly, because they want to try to point you to the traditions that Uthman made 4 copies. So that's why it's easier to go back to this starting point and ignore anything that came before it.
Okay, so they're still having to... They're still having to default back onto the traditions to even talk about those 4. So everything they're going to say, they have to always default back to 870, 875, 9th century, late 9th century, not even early 9th century. We're talking about late 9th century. So that's, to me, that is just falls in the same, you're following in the same rubric. You're still not supporting, you're still not helping me to understand how can you know what really happened. And first and foremost, if this is the case, if you do believe that there was let's call it a Q document. Let's just go ahead and put it, because it sounds like they're doing the same thing that the liberal Christian scholars have done with the Bible.
Except the Q here is interesting. The Q, right?
The Q document.
Here the Q is applicable. It is the Q.
It is the Q document, the questionable document, the big Q, big question, because we don't know what it is. Let's just call it Q, and that's what the liberal scholars have done with Christianity. They say we can see similarities between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but they're not always saying the same thing. Therefore, they must be coming from an even great earlier Q document that doesn't exist. Isn't that convenient? It never has existed. It's just something we thought about in the 20th century and now are continuing in the 21st century. It looks like that's exactly what these people like Sidky are doing. They have seen that this has worked for the biblical criticism. Why don't we then apply it to the Quranic criticism? Because then it supports what the traditions are saying, knowing that the traditions, and I'm sure Sidky knows this, and I'm sure who's this other man, Miram Van Putten. These are the 2 ones who are really pushing.
Marian Van Putten, yeah.
Marian Van Putten and Hythem Sidky, good friends of each other. They both live here in the United States, and they're pushing this idea that there is this original document. It did exist at the time of 652 AD, but we don't know where it is. It's just disappeared. Not just one, but 4 of them have all disappeared. We can't find anyone. Now stop and think, hold that through. If they had disappeared, you're only talking about 1,400 years ago, right?
That's right.
And you're talking about a context of power. That's what we're referring to. We're talking about political power. Am I correct?
That's correct.
So they control everything. Uthman controls everything. And so all the other caliphs after him control everything. Am I correct?
That's exactly what would have happened if they really had all that much control.
So why could they not preserve these 4 copies?
I mean, it's definitely interesting, without a doubt. I mean, these are the kind of logical questions to ask. If they definitely were in charge, and if they control everything, especially the political environment, and if no one dared to make any changes, and they wanted really their own copy to survive, then why do we have 7 readings? And why do we have evidence that more than that survived? 30, 40, some even go up to 40 different readings.
Okay, and readings we're going to talk about later. We're not talking about readings here. I'm not talking about readings again. Let's make a distinction.
I just want to show that, even these four, it was so difficult to even preserve those four different ways of pronouncing the Quran.
Okay, we're going to, in fact, let's go ahead, and since we brought in readings, maybe we should go ahead and define terms. What do you mean by readings? Because that will impinge on what we're going to say next.
I mean, in a very simple way, if you look at a word, right, you can pronounce this word in different ways.
Kitaba,
that's pretty much, like, for instance, I'm going to use the word in chapter 1 of the Quran, which is Al-Fatiha, verse 4, Maliki Yawmiddin, the king of the day of judgment. Now, you can read this word Malik in different ways. Malaka, he possessed the day of judgment. Malik, he's the one who owns it, basically. Or Malik, he's the king of that. So you see, the meanings can vary. You can write it probably the same way, but the way you pronounce is different, and it has a theological implications, without a doubt, in a case like this.
Okay, and of course, in a case like this, if you're reading a skeletal text, how can you read it differently? Looking at a skeletal text with no diacritical marks and with no vowelization, how would you read it differently? Or how would you write it differently so people could see which one you're choosing of those three possibilities?
Well, I mean, if different than these three, I mean, in this word, I mean, I can't really think of anything else beyond that, but there are words that could be.
No, I'm just saying, just take Maliki. Let's take Maliki, Malik. How would you write that differently to show exactly which of those three you wanted for that verse? How would you write it in a 7th century script?
You're just gonna write basically based on these consonantal, letters, without any diacritical markings or dottings.
Okay, well, there's no diacritical markings now, so I'm still asking, how do you write it? There's no dots, no vowels.
You just write mim, lam, kaf. And that's it. And it's up for the reader now to decide how it's pronounced.
Okay, so it's the pronunciation that makes the reading different. Am I correct?
Yep.
So if you have Uthman there, who is a political power of his day, and he sees that this Quran has different readings, he's not seeing it on the text. He's hearing it pronounced by a person who is actually reading the text.
Correct.
But it's not there on the page.
Correct. That reading itself, you cannot find it in these earlier Quranic manuscripts until you begin to see later on the system that was introduced to help you with that.
This did not exist in the 7th century.
No.
Because Sidky comes back on Dan and says very clearly that there were diacritical marks in the 7th century.
They are rare, and they're not as prevalent as when you get to the late 8th, for instance, and 9th century, and then, of course, beyond that. Now, you may come across, by the way, some earlier manuscript that may have it, but I would argue, how can you prove to me then, as a researcher, that those diacritical markings that are found in the 7th century copies that were not added later?
Okay, and we do know this in the Topkapi, for instance. We have a friend that's actually studying the Topkapi, and he says that these are even written in a different colored ink, proving that they were written at a later time. And the reason why, because somebody in the 8th or 9th or even 10th century who saw this text could not read it, could not understand it, could not see the context for it. He didn't know if this was king or order of the day. He didn't know which one, so he just put the dots in there to help him and those who come behind him. So that's all done at a later date, and you cannot date the ink, can't you? Why is it you can't date the ink?
I'm not aware of any technology yet that could help you date the ink. So whenever we talk about dating a manuscript, you're only dating the letter, which means the age of the animal, like when the animal died, possibly. That's about
we'll be getting into the whole thing with radiocarbon dating in another segment, because that's hugely, and there's some new material that we need to introduce to our hearers that they've not heard yet to help them out with that. So here, we're really talking about two things here. One is that this whole area of study is very difficult today to talk about because it just doesn't exist in the Muslim world. So Muslims, when they hear us being critical, when they hear us saying that maybe this Quran is not the same that was from the time of Muhammad, their immediate reaction is, you're lying, or they change the subject, or they go off into a whole tirade of vitriol against us, because for them, they're not used to this kind of criticism. That's understandable. We see that all the time. We'll probably see it in some of the comments we have below here after this recording. So you've got that problem. And so that's why I now understand why it had to take a Westerner. It had to take, in this case, an American, Dan Gibson, Dan Gibson. He does another book, and he does some similar things. No one's done what Dan Gibson has done with the Qibla. But certainly Dan Brubaker, it took him to actually finally get this in print so that we could have it, have access to it, use it, and now start getting it into the public sphere. And that's what our job is, yours and mine, isn't it, Al-Fadi? To get it out there so people can engage with it. But when you do get someone like Dan Brubaker, who is finally writing this down and putting it out there, a response from a Western, in this case, Hythem Sidky, who is a Westerner, he lives not too far from where Dan lives. They know each other. They're friends. You can see that he also does not understand well, maybe I put it out as a question. He obviously is coming from the traditional standpoint, which is where all Muslims come from, which surprises me because he doesn't need to come from a from a Muslim standpoint. He's not a Muslim himself. He's not, therefore, what's the word I'm looking for? He's not, therefore, he doesn't have to take the Muslim line because he should be a Western scholar. He claims to be a Western scholar. So why has he taken this supposition that the traditions are correct? Why has he defaulted into al-Bukhari and this idea that this book, the Quran, was canonized, was finalized, was in 4 copies by Uthman in 652, sent out to 4 provinces, though there were 9 provinces? Why do you think that he has started from this default? I would love to sit down and ask Hythem Sidky that. It's obviously that Dan doesn't, and you and I don't. We are suspicious of any traditions. We've said this many times. So we, from a standpoint, would always start, let's be skeptical first. Let's see where the evidence leads us. And so far, I have not seen anybody that can come up with a copy of this Uthmanic recension, of which there are 4. I'd like to see one.
And I doubt you're going to find it, at least so far. And I have my own theory, by the way. The academic field obviously has to make a choice, a political correctness choice. If you deviate from the traditional view, you are going to face backlash, just like Dr. Brubaker's book faced. Otherwise, stick with the traditional view and everybody will just pretend you don't even exist.
Okay, so you think he's doing it for political correctness? You don't think he really believes this? He's just doing it to placate those who pay his bills.
All I'm saying is, Hythem Sidky and others know very well, you want to come out and critique the traditional approach in a vocal way, writing an article, writing a book, research that is published out there, appear on a show like this, you are going to definitely face the backlash. Otherwise, you can keep it to yourself. Maybe you can keep your own thoughts, but try not to make it public, and you'll be fine.
So doors will be closed to him, is what you're saying?
Oh, I'm sure it will. I mean, donation doors will be closed. Endowment doors will be closed. There's so many things out there that could be at risk.
So you're saying what you grew up with there in Saudi Arabia is now coming to the West?
It's been in the West for a while, actually. Look at the prominent universities in the UK and in the US, the Islamic study centers. They bear almost the same name everywhere you go, or at least they have big oil money invested in them.
Okay, when you say oil money, you're talking about Saudi Arabian oil money.
And similar other places. You have many of these countries that are rich with oil wealth, and they have basically gave endowment and gave grants. It comes with a strings attached, basically.
Okay, and one of this, you are not to be critical of the traditional stance.
Actually,
I would hate to think that that's what's happening with Sidky. I would like to see him defend.
Speak for him. I really cannot speak for his behalf.
We can't. He's not here. Therefore, it might be good if maybe he could respond to this. Why he is so indoctrinated with the traditional account that The traditional account, meaning the Al-Bukhari's reference in volume 6, that these were created, the final Quran, the one I have in my hand today, is exactly the same as that. Let's call it the Q document that was created by Uthman in 652, of which 4 copies were made, which then means that every time you see as Dan's going to find out, every time you see a variant, you're going to have to start from the premise that these variants are nothing more than scribal errors, which is the position that Sidky takes, isn't it?
That's right.
We'll be getting into that in another broadcast. We don't have time to do that. I don't want to bring up a whole nother can of worms. But can you see we're starting to go, depending on how or where you start, when you look at an object, or when you, in this case, you look at a book, or when you look at manuscripts, depending on where you start, you're going to have complete different conclusions.
And absolutely. I mean, and I liked your question at the beginning about the presuppositions, because it is your starting point will determine where your thoughts and research conclusions going to lead. And in my case, like I said, I mean, my starting point is that even if the Uthmanic tradition, by the way, existed, I still have my own ways of assessing my findings. I have different ways of looking at it. If it existed, then my conclusion will be this. And if it didn't exist, then my conclusions will lead into that.
Yeah. And I'm assuming when I look at both Dan and when I look at both Hythem, Brubaker and Sidky, when I look at Dan, his supposition is let's see where the empirical evidence leads us. Let's don't start with a premise. Let's don't try to prove a point. Let's just see where it leads us. In some ways, that's how Brubaker's always been, hasn't he? Brubaker has said, he said in his introduction, that when he went into this whole quest, he was expecting to find a few variants. That's about all he was looking for.
I think he was looking for 8, if I recall, and he ended up with 800, and now he's over 4,000.
Now it's over 4,000. With his doctorate, he had 800. Now it's up over 4,000 and still counting. He's still finding them. So he went with what he found. And as he found more, he had to make sense of it. As he tried to make sense with it, he tried to come up with some type of conclusions. As he came to these conclusions, he decided to write it down. And that's what we have here. Now, this is just the first of many. He's in the process of actually publishing a brand new one, which is going to come out hopefully next month. So it'll be a second one in the series. And that one is going to be following this material right here that you see on the cover. So it's going to be fascinating because more and more he's going to be publishing, and he's going to be asking much of the same questions, which are going to be creating a lot more of the reactions. But I think what we're doing, and I think where we're helping Dan, we're helping Hythem, is that we're taking it out so that the rest of people, because an awful lot of the material, when you read this paper here, this one here by Sidky, it's very difficult to read. I would imagine most people reading it will not understand an awful lot of it because it is very technical. It's talking about areas that most of us don't understand. I had to go to you to get help from you guys because this is even not my area of expertise. And I had to sit there and try to understand and put my head around it to see where he was coming from before I could even respond to it. Now, we do want to do more of these. We do want to go and unpack more of these.
Could you kindly let's give our viewers an idea about what other areas we're going to venture into, maybe the next 2 or 3 at least, so that they are, in the mood to anticipate this.
We've only gone through 2 of the 13 that I want to unpack. So the first one we've looked as, why is it that this is the first of its kind? That's the first one we've done. Why is it that Dan is doing something that has not been done already by those who really hold the Quran up as their authority? They should be the ones who are actually doing this criticism. Biblical criticism was done by Christians. It wasn't done by outsiders. It was done by Christians themselves, which is where it should be. Secondly, we've also gone into this whole political environment. What is different about the political environment that the Quran grew up in versus the Bible? Then what I want to do in the next broadcast when we come back is I want to go and talk about the diacritical marks. I want to unpack, what do we mean by the diacritical? Why is the diacritical marks different than, say, the Razm or the consonantal text? And then we're going to get into script grammar, whereas I'm going to have you help me understand that because I don't understand script grammar. Unpack why is that important to this whole discussion. We want to go into radiocarbon dating, and I've been doing a lot of research, getting it from an awful lot, and we have a scholar who's working on this right now. We're going to introduce some of this new research into what we have on radiocarbon. That's going to be exciting. We may have to do a whole program just on radiocarbon dating.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's extremely important for people to understand that, and it's sometimes it's damaging as well. I mean, like the Birmingham folios that you even addressed at some point, and then people like Dr. Gabriel Said Reynolds and others, got into the mix whenever those folios were released 2 or 3 years ago.
Well, we're going to introduce some brand new material that's since 2015. That was all done in 2015. We're now in 2020. And this is the nice thing. The great thing about this whole type of research, it just keeps moving on, new material. So we'll
Right.
introduce that when we get into the radiocarbon dating. Then we're going to go into the whole area of razm versus readings. What do we mean by qira'at and ahruf versus the razm? These are Arabic names,
Yep.
but you'll define them. You're going to help us unpack them. This is your area of expertise, so I'm going to let you, Al-Fadi, run with this when we get into it. And then we're going to look into what we know as orthographical variants. This is paleography. What is it that we use paleographically to understand and unpack and see the differences and orthographical differences? And then we're going to look at what happened with the 1924 Cairene edition. I want to unpack that. What exactly did this Muhammad ibn al-Huzayni al-Haddad, what did he choose? And why is it that is it that significant, or is it not that significant? So we'll get into that later on. We'll probably be going through this sequence as I'm reading them. We then want to go into dating the orthographical canon. Where and when, where is this Uthmanic recension? Where is the first example we have of this? Does it exist? Can we find it? Is it anywhere that we can look at? And if not, then what's the closest we can get to? So when was that razm finally canonized? The razm, not the diacritical marks, not the vowelizations. We know that was done in 1924. I want to know when the razm, the skeletal text, was finally canonized. We want to bring in, because Sidky does talk and does confront Dan or Dr. Brubaker with his view on King versus Gibson. We'll probably do a quick segment on that because you and I have exhausted that one.
And that was extremely surprising to me, if you ask me. I mean, I'm not so sure really how he ended up going that direction, technically.
I will tell you how, and I've got a good reason as to why he did this. But when we get to that, we'll unpack it at that time. I want to get into the whole thing of this archetype, this Q document, what he refers to as the Uthmanic recension, this Uthmanic project, this Uthmanic archetype. I want to get into that. That's an exciting one.
I think that could be one show in and of itself, because that's the foundation almost for everything that the whole paper is based on.
And we might put that one up next. We might bring that to the fore. These are the sequence that Sidky went through, so I'm following his sequence. And then I want to do an entire show on Western academic Islam versus popular Orthodox Islam. One of the problems that I see coming out here is there is a huge dichotomy. We've kind of opened it up a little bit today between what is happening in academia, but not just Islamic academia, even in Western academia, versus what is happening on the ground, where we and I have to deal with. In fact, I would support and I would assume that almost all those who are watching us today are from the latter category. There may be some academics watching us, but I guess most of them, I would imagine, most of those who are going to comment are from this more populist Orthodox standpoint. And then I want to talk about early and late standardization. When did the standardization come? Did the standardization come as Sidky believes with Uthman, or did the standardization come as Brubaker believes sometime later? When can we find and where can we go to find this standardization? So those are 13 areas. Now, some of them are similar, so we may not do 13 different segments. We might just do 4 or 5 in one. I might move them around so that they all flow better. But I think it's been good that we've started this segment out, this first hour, looking at, first of all, why is it that this is so different? Why is it that Dan has done us a favor? And why is it we need to have Hythem Sidky's actually giving us responses? We need this peer review. We need to have this kind of discussion, and we need it here on this broadcast. And we also then looked at the environment from which these two different scriptures were created. This one was created in a strong political environment. This one was created with not a political environment at all. It was created by consensus. And the consensus was there from the very beginning. We've always known which are the books to do that. So it's important that we do a like with like rather than try to measure apples with oranges.
That is correct, and really, I want to give credit to Hythem for taking the time really to do that review. I think it's healthy. and it helped us now bring to the forefront these issues that he raised. And at the same time, it's helping also bring to the forefront yet again the work of Dr. Brubaker, which, in my view, as a former Muslim, is a groundbreaking work. And that's extremely important for our Muslim friends to be exposed to. And we will talk more about that. So thank you, brother, for joining me. I'm excited, of course, that we will continue doing this. And maybe even when we go back to our studios, we will be able to take this work and do it yet again in a different format, as we typically do. Obviously, we've done something recently similar to this, and that's the contrast between Dr. King's critique of Gibson's work, and how we brought all of these critical items to the forefront and showed that Gibson really still have the strong hand when it came to the argument itself. Well, any last words you want to share with us?
No, this has been a good introduction into what we need to do, where we need to go. As I'll say to the viewers, we're not planning this. We're not getting going and say we're going to say this versus what we're going to say this. We're actually doing it as we see it, and we're actually following how Sidky, the sequence Sidky followed. We're going to try to follow that sequence, but in some ways, we're doing the same thing with Sidky, what we did with David King. We're asking questions of David King, looking at his presupposition. Like David King started from a supposition that was completely different than that of Dad Gibson. Isn't that a case? David King started from the supposition that the 9th, 10th, and 11th century scholars were the most informative, and they were the ones who were the most authoritative, therefore just follow what they said and pretty much just mimic their conclusions. Dan Gibson says, no, that's too late. We need to go back to where the empirical evidence lies. We need to go back to where the empirical evidence leads us. And remember, he also went to those mosques not knowing what he was going to find. He had no idea what he was going to find. We're shocked to realize there's not just one or two or three or four different mosques that were off. There were hundreds, over 100 that were off. In some ways, Dr. Brubaker has started from the same premise. And in case you see on one hand, you see that Sidky is starting from the premise that the traditions are correct. There's no reason to go beyond it. Let's stick with the traditions. And if they're correct, then we've got to try to find ways to understand why this, where this standard, where this archetype, where this Q document exists, what it was, and why is it had to exist because the traditions say it had to exist. Brubaker says, no, I'm not willing to go with the traditions. They're written too late. I want to go and see what the empirical evidence lies, much like Dan Gibson. Both of them are named Dan. Isn't that interesting? They're both going with where the empirical evidence leads us. And I think we need to do the same. I think we're going to come to the same conclusions as we continue with these broadcasts one after another.
Absolutely. And I just want to let our viewers know that this is a theme that you will see myself and Dr. J doing more and more, and that's to take some of this academic research that usually is hidden from even many of you, actually, and we want to bring it right here publicly to the public arena. And we want to do it in the most professional, respectful way. We're here not to attack anyone. We're here just to dialogue with the findings and the critique, and let you, the audience, be the judge of these findings. All right, brother. Well, thank you so much. We're glad you're doing well. And just to let people know, this live stream was actually live on my Facebook page, alfadi.sira, on my YouTube channel, Sira International. And tomorrow, I think you said it will be also at...
It'll be up there tonight. I'll put it up tonight on Fender Films.
Fender Films, yeah. And of course, a reminder, brother, how can people support your ministry? Please share that with them.
Yeah, when you go up on the Fender Films, just look up on the button at the on the upper right hand side, and you will see a Patreon. If you just push that Patreon and listen, we both Al-Fadi and I, we are not salaried. We do not have salaries. We are defunded by people like you. We only survive because people like you actually keep us going. I've been doing this for 38 years, so we are faith-based. And both of us do need funding. We do, to continue to do our research, to continue to do our writing, and also to continue to do our recording. And also continue to do our responses. So do help us out. Go and fund us. Same with you, Al-Fadi. You're also sponsored on Patreon. So please do feel free to keep us doing what we're doing so we can get it out to you so you can continue to hear what you're hearing.
Thank you, brother. And thank you to all of you for joining us on yet another episode of Let Us Reason. Until we meet again next time, Have a blessed day. God bless.
Bye bye.